Welcome to Horror Stories Fanatics. If you enjoy this type of content, then subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on any of our latest and greatest uploads. In the 5 years between 1978 and 1973, Dennis Nilsen brought home 15 young men with him from London bars. After they'd go to sleep in his flat, he'd strangle and dismember them, burying them under his floorboards, in his yard, or even burning their bodies in bonfires. But it wasn't until his neighbors called a plumber for their clogged drains in 1983 that human remains were found in the property's pipes, and their upstairs neighbor, Nilsen, was arrested. A new Netflix documentary, Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen Tapes, drops on August 18th. And recounts Dennis Nilsen's horrific crimes using Nilsen's own audio recordings from prison, as well as interviews with those impacted by him to tell the terrible tale. The documentary about the notorious British serial killer traces the timeline of his life from childhood through his killings up to his 1983 arrest. Dennis Nilsen grew up in Scotland and, according to his tapes, was sexually abused by his grandfather until his grandfather's death when Nilsen was 5 years old. Nilsen also explains in his tapes that he realized he was gay when he was 8 years old. He served in the army before he moved to Britain, where he first worked as a security guard before eventually becoming a police officer. According to his tapes, he resigned due to homophobia in the department. A fellow officer interviewed in the documentary calls Nilsen a real loner. At the time of his arrest, Nilsen was working at a job center in London. A few years before Nilsen's murder spree began, the police were called to Nilsen's flat after a teenaged boy jumped out of the third-floor window one night. He needed 100 stitches, but survived, and claimed that he had jumped after he'd woken up stripped naked with Nilsen attacking him. But according to the Netflix doc, the boy's family did not want him to testify publicly, so Nilsen was never charged for the crime. His killings began in 1978. Nilsen frequented gay bars in London's West End and targeted runaways, homeless boys, drug users, and sex workers, according to Netflix's documentary. Similar to American killer John Wayne Gacy, many of his young victims were selected deliberately because they were less likely to be reported missing. He'd lure them to his home with the promise of food and alcohol, and once they had fallen asleep, he'd strangle them to death. But it was not the 15 missing victims that helped the authorities catch on to him, or even the survivors who did report their encounters to the police. It was instead a clogged drain pipe in his flat, the second apartment of his in which he'd been disposing of his victims' bodies. When a plumber found 4 fingers and some human flesh in the building's drain pipes on February 9th, the police entered Nilsen's apartment, immediately smelled death, and arrested him. He initially confessed to killing 15 young men and boys, and after searches of that location and that of his previous flat, authorities recovered 11 bodies. Sadly, only 8 of Nilsen's 15 victims have been officially identified. Graham Allen, 27, Malcolm Barlow, 23, Martin Duffy, 16, Stephen Holmes, 14, John Howlett, 23, Kenneth Ockenden, 23, Stephen Sinclair, 20, and William Sutherland, 26. Nilsen pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, with his defense arguing that he was insane. He was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, and was sentenced to life in prison in November 1983. In prison, Nilsen was allowed to keep 2 budgie birds named Hamish and Tweedles, whose chirping can be heard in the tapes played in Netflix's documentary. The serial killer also produced 250 hours worth of tapes while in prison, co-wrote a biography called Killing for Company in 1985 with Brian Masters, as well as his own memoir, History of a Drowning Boy, over a period of 18 years. The memoir was banned from release in 2001 and was only published this May. Dennis Nilsen served 34 years of his sentence before he died at the age of 72 in prison after suffering a pulmonary embolism and a hemorrhage and undergoing surgery. He died in May of 2018. In an interview conducted on the 10th of February, Nilsen confessed there were further human remains stowed in a tea chest in his living room, with other remains inside an upturned drawer in his bathroom. The dismembered body parts were the bodies of 3 men, all of whom he had killed by strangulation, usually with a necktie. One victim he could not name, another he knew only as John the Guardsman, and the third he identified as Stephen Sinclair. He also stated that beginning in December 1978, he had killed 12 or 13 men at his former address, 195 Melrose Avenue. Nilsen also admitted to having unsuccessfully attempted to kill approximately 7 other people who had either escaped or on one occasion had been at the brink of death but had been revived and allowed to leave his residence. A further search for additional remains at Cranley Gardens on the 10th of February revealed the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, a section of a torso, and various bones in the tea chest. The same day, Nilsen accompanied police to Melrose Avenue, where he indicated the 3 locations in the rear garden where he had burned the remains of his victims. Catran contacted the Daily Mirror on the 10th of February, informing the newspaper of the ongoing search for human remains at Cranley Gardens, leading the newspaper to break the story and spark intense national media interest. By the 11th of February, reporters from the Mirror had obtained photographs from Nilsen's mother in Aberdeenshire, which appeared on their front page the following day. Under English law, the police had 48 hours in which to charge Nilsen or release him, assembling the remains of the victims killed at Cranley Gardens on the floor of Hornsey Mortuary. Professor Bowen was able to confirm the fingerprints on one body matched those on police files of Sinclair. At 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February, Nilsen was charged with Sinclair's murder, and a statement revealing this was released to the press. Formal questioning of Nilsen began the same evening, with Nilsen agreeing to be represented by a solicitor, a facility he had earlier declined. Police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions over the following days, in interviews which totaled over 30 hours. Nilsen was adamant that he was uncertain as to why he had killed, simply saying, "I'm hoping you will tell me that," when asked his motive for the murders. He was adamant that the decision to kill was not made until moments before the act of murder. Most victims had died by strangulation. On several occasions, he had drowned the victims once they had been strangled into unconsciousness. Once the victim had been killed, he typically bathed the victim's body, shaved any hair from the torso to conform it to his physical ideal, then applied makeup to any obvious blemishes upon the skin. The body was usually dressed in socks and underpants before Nilsen draped the victims around him as he talked to the corpse. With most victims, Nilsen masturbated as he stood alongside or knelt above the body, and Nilsen confessed to having occasionally engaged in intercrural sex with his victims' bodies, but repeatedly stressed to investigators that he had never actually penetrated his victims, explaining that his victims were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. All the victims' personal possessions were destroyed following the ritual of bathing their bodies in an effort to obliterate their identity prior to their murder, and they're now becoming what Nilsen described as a prop in his fantasies. In several instances, he talked to the victim's body as it remained seated in a chair or prone on his bed, and he recalled being emotional as he marveled at the beauty of their bodies. With reference to one victim, Kenneth Ockenden, Nilsen noted that Ockenden's body and skin were very beautiful, adding the sight almost brought me to tears. Another, unidentified victim had been so emaciated that he had simply been discarded under the floorboards. The bodies of the victims killed at his previous address were kept for as long as decomposition would allow. Upon noting any major signs of decomposition in a body, Nilsen stowed it beneath his floorboards. If a body did not display any signs of decomposition, he occasionally alternately stowed it beneath the floorboards and retrieved it before again masturbating, as he stood over or lay alongside the body. Makeup was again applied to enhance its appearance and to obscure blemishes. When questioned as to why the heads found at Cranley Gardens had been subjected to moist heat, Nilsen stated that he frequently boiled the heads of his victims in a large cooking pot on his stove so that the internal contents evaporated, thus removing the need to dispose of the brain and flesh. The torsos and limbs of the 3 victims killed at this address were dissected within about 1 week of their murder before being wrapped in plastic bags and stowed in the 3 locations he had indicated to police. When questioned as to whether he had any remorse for his crimes, Nilsen replied, "I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He also emphasized that he took no pleasure from the act of killing, but worshiped the art and the act of death. And with that, we've reached the end of this video, all about the crimes of Dennis Nilsen. If you enjoyed it and you found it helpful, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content just like it.